Thank you for joining us once again for reading the Bible together. We are so glad that you are here, and we hope you're looking forward to another episode of Colossians. This week we're going to talk about putting off old clothes and putting on new clothes. But just real quick before we jump in, I just want to remind you about some of the ideas that we spoke about last week, that there would be in every town, there would be, or many towns, there would be a synagogue with Jews and converts to Judaism. They valued the Torah because of the serious mindedness of it. And I think a lot of people are genuinely attracted to Yahweh and his goodness and sovereignty and love. And we see examples of that. In fact, the encounter between Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch that we talked about probably about 2 years ago today on this program. But you can go back and look it up in Acts, is a very good example of somebody who had converted to Judaism because they read the scriptures and the character of Yahweh appealed to them. And so they were trying to follow God in the best way they could. And then, of course, there's going to be Jews in a synagogue in every town practicing the Torah. And so, and a lot of what may have appealed to some people about the Torah is the discipline of it and the serious mindedness of it. And, it is important to have spiritual discipline. It is important to be very devoted to God. And there are lots of ways that we can push ourselves in that direction. But something we're going to talk about this week, okay, that we need to really make sure that we delve into kind of in our own spiritual walk, and being honest with ourselves. If we feel that our spiritual practices are making us spiritually advanced, and that we're doing that because we want to be able to look down on other people, then we really aren't doing business with God. And we have to put that idea away from ourselves in order to really, really do business with God. So that's kind of an important review of last week with a little new note there at the end. But we can go back to this idea that we're not enough, right? And we talked about this a little bit last week as well. When we're approaching God as that's, there were lots of people pretending, or maybe they thought they really were in the ancient world, that they did have a way to communicate with God, right? And this idea that you have to have, temples and rituals and everything does get us halfway there, because there's this idea that we aren't good enough to be in God's presence, and we're not. But we can't really do the other half ourselves, right? Doing these practices might be important to help us get our head space, where we need to be to pay attention to the things God is saying to us. But, no matter how, whatever you can think of that would be the modern day equivalent of all these practices that were being discussed both in the Old and New Testaments, that's not what gets us to God. You can't, a relationship with God is not a do-it-yourself thing. Actually, any relationship's not a do-it-yourself thing. That's part of it being a relationship. But the thing is, in order for us to really have a relationship to God, what Paul is saying is that we must die. Now, that's very upsetting if you don't hear the rest of this, so I hope nobody's internet cut off just then. But we've actually discussed this. We talked about this earlier on in Colossians. We talked about Jesus' death and resurrection being sort of having this ambassador idea, as Jesus is the ambassador, and so what's true of him is also true of us. Remember, if you don't remember, we did, I promise, talk about it, I think in the third session that we did. And so that is the idea that we're going to work on today, is thinking about what Jesus' death and resurrection has done for us and what it means in our daily lives, like working that out in our relationship with him and other human beings. And of course, our walk with God, our relationship with other human beings, and just fleshing it out in our daily life. Okay, so let's go to chapter 3. Let's go to Colossians chapter 3. And let's skip down to verses 5 through 8. Put to death, therefore, whatever in you is earthly: fornication, impurity, passion, evil desire, and greed, which is idolatry. On account of these, the wrath of God is coming on those who are disobedient. These are the ways that you also once followed when you were living that life. But now you must get rid of all such things: anger, wrath, malice, slander, and abusive language from your mouth. Okay, so those are the old behaviors. And notice, this is going to, come as a surprise to some people if you read it carefully, that sexual sin and speech are on the same level for Paul. Okay? And we tend to, we tend to sometimes put one as being worse than the other, or one as being less important than the other. And for Paul, they are the same. And Paul is basically of the mind that these are both gifts from God. Okay? And if we use them correctly, they are making us more fully human. We are participating in God's creation in a way that he has designed us to. And if we abuse these gifts, we are making ourselves less human, and we are tearing ourselves and each other, our communities, our families, our churches apart, and damaging ourselves and his creation. So Paul doesn't want this kind of strife and division in the church. So this is what he says that he is going for. And we're skipping around in chapter 3 today. But as always, on Reading the Bible Together, we hope that you go back and read these maybe a couple times on your own and catch some of the verses in between. But we're going to move down to verse 11. This might be a very familiar verse for some of you. In that renewal, there is no longer Greek and Jew, circumcised and uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave, and free, but Christ is all and in all. And some of these terms may mean more to us than others, but basically, people from as close to you to as far away from you as possible, all. Okay, all. Christ is all in you, and Christ is all in them. Okay, so last week we talked about how we're not going to be ruled over by men who, and when he says men, he means other human beings who lay out a whole bunch of rules for us and say, here's how you be spiritual. And here we're saying, and you can't do it yourself either. And you must be ruled over by somebody, Christ. Christ is the king. And these are behaviors that we're going to put away because they can tear us apart and tear our communities apart. And instead, we're going to be unified no matter who you are or where you're from, under Christ the King. Now, if those are things we're not doing, then, of course, we need to talk about what are we doing, okay? So let's look at verses 12 through 15. As God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience. Bear with one another, and if anyone has a complaint against another, forgive each other, just as the Lord has forgiven you. So you also must forgive. Above all, clothe yourselves with love, which binds everything together in perfect harmony. And let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, to which indeed you were called, in the one body, and be thankful. Remember, we said the idea of gratitude goes all throughout Colossians last week. All right, so some might say these behaviors are going to make people wimps. Okay, that accusation has been leveled at Christians in the past, right? Compassion and kindness, humility. People don't really like being humble. Meekness, that one's been misinterpreted a lot, and patience. But we need to understand, okay, that being kind doesn't mean that you never ever tell people things they don't want to hear, okay? And being meek does not mean you're a doormat. It just means that you are subservient to the King, which is Christ, and that you take that knowledge with you and the fact that you're talking to his creations, all right, who he loves, into any situation, into any conversation with another human being, right? That's what that means, okay? That's the first thing. And then the second thing is, I don't think that things like forgiveness so it says, if anyone has a complaint against another, forgive each other, just as the Lord has forgiven you, so also you must forgive. That is not for the faint of heart. True forgiveness is not for the faint of heart. And love, real, true love, not just, giving somebody everything they want, but actually really pouring yourself into another person in a godly way. That is not for the faint of heart either. And so we have to find the ways that we can do these things, and the ways that we can be the kind of humans and the kind of community that God wants us to be. It's also this idea, we need to also be sure that we understand that the direction that Paul is coming from here, we're trying to be genuine human beings, okay? And we have to be very clear. We have to be very true in our speech. Like that's another, like the whole, the speech and sexual sin thing. You can't say lies about someone and then turn around and preach the gospel of truth. But we also need to have understanding. And we need to really think deeply about all of these things and how our misbehavior in these areas can poison our communities. And so I'm going to read a quote from N.T. Wright, who wrote a commentary on Colossians. And I'm going to read just a little excerpt from what he said. As so often in Colossians, it seems that contrary to what a lot of people today imagine, being a Christian means learning to think harder, not leave your brain behind in the quest for new experiences. So really thinking about what your actions mean and how they impact others. Thinking straight and knowing the truth are part of what it means to be a truly human being, the sort of human being the gospel is meant to create. We'll see you next week.